Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Annapolis Maritime Museum's fourth lecture in this year's series. I am Kelly Swartout, Director of Development. I want to remind you that our principal mission is to educate students and adults on the area's celebrated maritime heritage and the ecology of the Chesapeake Bay. Tonight's lecture helps us to fulfill that mission. I know many of you here tonight are members, and I want to take this opportunity to personally thank you. Your support is truly a vote of confidence in the work we do to educate and offer hands-on experiences and explorations about the maritime industry and environment. A huge thank you goes out to each and every one of you. Please remember, our museum is open Tuesdays through Sundays, 10 to 3, and admission is always free to our members. If you're not a member, please consider joining. While at the museum, check out our store for books, trinkets, and other items you can't live without. For those of you who are interested in purchasing the C. Ritterbush book, Working Waterfront, it is now back in stock. The book and other great items offered make great gifts for your Valentine. We have some new items to offer, like this beautifully crafted oyster keychain and this wine stopper for all your wine connoisseurs. Just visit our store or shop online at amaritime.org. Before we begin, please take a moment to look at the bottom of your webinar screen. You will see a Q&A button. Please submit any questions you have for our speaker through this feature during the lecture. The sooner you submit your questions, the more likely it is that they will be answered. So do not wait until the end. We will be monitoring the questions as they come in, and we'll try our best to address as many as we can during the Q&A session at the conclusion of the lecture. The chat button will be used by us to share information with you tonight. If you are having any technical issues or need to contact us for assistance, please call 410-295-0104 extension 19. I am pleased to thank J.P. Morgan as our presenting sponsor this year. J.P. Morgan Private Bank has been serving families in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia with their banking, lending, and wealth management needs for over 100 years. The greater Maryland community to which we belong is primarily served by a team of 17 professionals in Baltimore. Fellow Eastport resident David Thompson joined the team in 2020 to work with clients here at Annapolis and Southern Maryland. We are thrilled to have David, his wife, and baby girl join us as community members. Back again this year is Homestead Gardens as our speaker sponsor. Homestead Gardens is a landmark nursery in Davidsonville, Maryland, having the largest enclosed garden center in the Baltimore-Washington metropolitan area. Homestead Gardens has a second location in Severna Park. They are a wonderful partner of AMM, supporting our programs and events. If you have not been to either location, I encourage you to stop by for all your gardening needs. It is now time to grab your favorite beverage and get ready to hear from an amazing presentation from our speaker tonight, Dr. Leslie Reeder-Myers. Dr. Reeder-Myers is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Temple University and the director of Temple's Anthropology Laboratory and Museum. As an archaeologist and geographer, Dr. Reeder-Myers studies the impact of sea level rise and climate change on coastal populations in the past. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Leslie Reeder-Myers.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks for having me tonight. And thanks to everyone who is spending your Thursday evening listening to me talk a little bit about some really old oysters. So, as all of you are no doubt fully aware, we have pushed large parts of our global ecosystem to a point of fragility where a lot of the decisions that we make can have really profound impacts throughout our entire society. So these impacts can extend not only to ecosystems, but to the cultural and political and religious lives that are intertwined with those ecosystems. For decades now, ecologists have focused on the idea of sustainability, right? Developing strategies that get us what we need today, but also leave enough for the future. What we're starting to kind of realize, though, is that sustainability is a moving target. As climates change, as markets change, what was a good sustainable strategy 10 years ago might not really work anymore today. And as anthropologists and other social scientists have started to really join in this conversation, we started kind of shifting our aim a little bit more toward the concept of resilience. Okay, so resilient systems, including both the sort of natural or ecological world and the human or cultural world, resilient systems have the flexibility to adapt to the many challenges that we will face during the 21st century. Estuaries are a really important part of this conversation. The incredible productivity of these ecosystems mean that they're a great place for people to live, right? Many of you live on Chesapeake Bay, a wonderful estuary. They're sort of at this intersection between the land and the sea and rivers that make them a really great place to be. They often provide ports and harbors, places for long distance trade. And at one time, they produced enough food to feed very large populations. So as a result, many of the world's great cities are sitting on estuaries. But these estuaries also play a really important role in broader marine ecosystems. So they're sort of called the ocean's nursery because they protect the young of many, many marine species. So without healthy estuaries, it's really difficult for many fish and shellfish species to reproduce. They're important hosts for both biomass and biodiversity, which is very important in the conversation about resilience. So in other words, estuaries are these places where the cultural and social worlds of people come into direct conflict, or at least direct interaction with the ecological world. Many of the economic and recreational activities that are so important to our culture directly degrade the ecosystems that those same activities rely on through overfishing, through pollution, and through climate change. So it's not surprising that estuaries have become the focus of huge restoration efforts, right? When I talk to people like you who live in the areas where I work, I see over and over again that people care really deeply about these places, not just the ecologists, but the fishermen and the people who grew up with Chesapeake Bay, for example, as a central part of their cultural identity. All of these stakeholders are really deeply invested in restoring the bay. The question then becomes, what are we restoring it to? How do we know what strategies might be resilient in the face of sea level rise and climate change? How do we know what a resilient estuary looks like when we only have good records that go back a few decades? And that's where archaeology comes in. It turns out that it's really hard to understand sustainability and resilience without looking at a much longer time frame, not just decades or even a century, but multiple centuries or even thousands of years. One of the most common ways that archaeologists look at these ecosystems is through something we call middens. So middens are these places where people left behind the remains, in the case of Chesapeake Bay, the remains of oyster and other shellfish and other animals that they had consumed, along with broken pieces of pottery, stone tools, just other objects from their sort of day-to-day lives. These shell middens conveniently change the chemistry of the soil around them. And it helps preserve a lot of materials that otherwise don't particularly preserve, especially in our very acidic eastern soils here. So by looking at middens, we can see what ancient ecosystems were like, how people extracted resources, and how they used resources from these ecosystems. So the research that I'm going to talk to you about tonight started back in 2010. And from the beginning, it was an effort to do a research project that would yield results that helped today, right? That matter for today. And so for that purpose, we collaborated with ecologists and biologists from the very beginning, right? Trying to kind of figure out what we needed to know about the past to help make better decisions today. Initially, we really kind of zoomed in on the oyster fishery, and I'm going to spend most of my talk tonight talking about oysters. Toward the end of the project, though, we also sort of found an opportunity to look at what the Chesapeake ecosystem looked like as it was forming, and to think about the implications of that both in the past and today. So I'll come back to the second question, but for now, I want to focus on the oyster fishery. So why have I spent over a decade of my life looking at really old oyster shells? Well, over the past few centuries, oysters have been a really central part of Chesapeake culture. They form the basis for, of course, the unique waterman communities, but they're really important for the foodways and identity for all sorts of people who live around the Chesapeake. The archaeological record tells us that this is not a new phenomenon, that oysters have been important to the Chesapeake social and economic landscape for thousands of years. Oysters are not just important culturally, but also ecologically. They are organisms that we refer to as ecosystem engineers, which means that just through the simple act of living, they make the habitat better for other organisms. So oysters filter pollutants out of the water, which is important, has always been important for the larger ecosystem. But today it's even more important. And we're sort of in this little bit of a catch-22 where if we can get more oysters to grow in the bay, they will help a lot with this gargantuan task of cleaning the bay up. So the third reason that we looked at oysters is because we have a lot of oysters. They're important socially, they're important ecologically. They also are a really easy target in the archaeological record. Many of these sites are essentially entirely oyster. So we can find a lot of material to study. Okay, I'm going to kind of back out a little bit and spend a few minutes giving you some backgrounds on Mid-Atlantic archaeology. So what you're looking at here is what the Middle Atlantic looked like about 10,000 years ago. So here is, you can see the outline of Chesapeake Bay right here. So this is the modern Chesapeake Bay. So you can see things have changed quite a lot. 10,000 years ago, sea levels were maybe about 100 feet lower than they are today, maybe not quite that much. But what that means is this huge expanse of coastal plain that's underwater today was above water, was livable space. And Chesapeake Bay didn't exist yet. This was just the Susquehanna River Valley. Now, we know very, very little about the people who lived in this area at the time. There are long and messy arguments about exactly when people got here. We don't need to get into those arguments for any reason tonight, but we can be pretty sure that it was long before 10,000 years ago and long before Chesapeake Bay itself existed. So we're going to kind of step through every 1,000 years or so of what the bay looked like and talk a little bit about the people and the bay itself. So for the vast majority of this time period, people living in the mid-Atlantic were hunter-gatherers or hunter-gatherer fishers, people living along rivers, probably along the coastline, although those sites are far underwater today, but likely focusing on aquatic environments, mostly rivers. The bay itself, we have the very first evidence of estuary conditions up near the Potomac River just before 8,000 years ago. So this is when the Susquehanna River Valley started to flood as sea level started to rise. This process just kind of keeps on going. We still have this long, narrow estuary. And it's not until about 6,000 years ago that we have the first evidence for people using resources out of this newly forming estuary, along kind of what would at the time have been the drowned Susquehanna River Valley, the very beginnings of the central channel of Chesapeake Bay. Still very, very few sites. Again, these early stages just don't seem to have a huge impact on Middle Atlantic hunter-gatherers. They use the bay sometimes, but not a whole lot. Now, it's certainly almost certain that there are sites underwater today that would have been, closer to the edges of the estuary in the past. But even so, it doesn't seem like we see a huge shift in lifeways in this area. The bay kind of starts to open up a little bit by around 4,000 years ago. And 3,000 years ago, we start to see an even more well-developed bay. We also see the beginning of what we call the woodland period. And this is marked by the appearance of pottery in the archaeological records. So it's the first time people in the mid-Atlantic are starting to produce pottery. Now, around 2,000 years ago, things start to change much more dramatically. So the estuary itself is starting to stabilize. Sea level rise is almost to where it is today, right? There's not a whole lot more change that's going to happen. We see an explosion of archaeological sites around Chesapeake Bay just after 2,000 years ago. So more stable sea levels mean more stable ecosystems, more productive oyster reefs. It also means that we're losing fewer sites to sea level rise. So things are also just going to be a lot more visible. Also around this time, we have much higher indigenous populations. So all of these things come together so that we have far, far more archaeological sites starting about 2,000 years ago. Now around 1,000 years ago, again, still more archaeological sites. This is when we start to see the development of agriculture. There's been agriculture, but we start to see the development of corn, beans, and squash agriculture going on in the mid-Atlantic. We start to see people living in villages for large portions of the year and developing these much more complex political arrangements to deal with larger populations of people who are living here. And then, of course, we have the arrival of Europeans a few centuries later. So the arrival of John Smith and later European explorers and colonists, this is linked very heavily to changes in both the ecosystems and the culture, of course, of Chesapeake Bay. So John Smith, when he arrived, remarked that oyster reefs were so extensive in the bay that they were a hazard to ships trying to navigate. Ecologists have estimated that oysters at this time could have filtered all of the water in Chesapeake Bay over the course of just 2 or 3 days. And archaeological sites from the centuries before John Smith's arrival also show us that oysters were a very important part of Native American culture and food. 300 years later, oysters are still a really important part of the economy and culture of Chesapeake Bay. So if you're having a little trouble figuring out what you're looking at here, this is the Darling and Sons oyster packing plant. And these are piles of discarded oyster shell. So a couple of people standing here on the edge of the pile to provide some scale. That's a lot of oyster shell. I've looked at a lot of oyster shell and I can tell you that's a lot of oyster shell. But this was really near the beginning of the end of the oyster fishery in Chesapeake. So what you can see here is a graph of catch records for oysters in the northern part of Chesapeake Bay for this period from 1870 up to about 2014. And what you're looking at here is a pretty classic example of ecological collapse. So shortly after the turn of the 20th century, when Darling and Sons and many other oyster packing plants were still doing good business, overfishing contributed to the initial collapse of the oyster population, along with agricultural runoff and pollution. The fishery kind of struggled along for several decades, and for watermen living today, this is kind of the baseline that they tend to think of as a good fishery in the sort of middle of the 20th century. But by this point, the ecosystem had really very little resilience left in it. And when a new disease was introduced in the 1980s, the bottom pretty much fell out for oysters in the bay. So we estimate that the oysters left today represent about 1% of those that were in the bay in 1900. And of course, we have very little idea of how those numbers relate to sort of what oyster populations were like before the beginning of industrial scale oyster harvesting. The result is a complete shift in the economy of Chesapeake Bay, where tourism and recreation now play a huge role and oyster fishing very much less. So in 2007, two prominent oyster ecologists in Chesapeake said this about restoration efforts in the bay. We must accept the fact that efforts to date to restore native oyster populations have failed, and the prognosis for improvement of the situation is continued failure. And they also raised the possibility that in order to fix this problem, we should introduce a non-native species that's resistant to diseases. Maybe they're right. Maybe the only way to restore the ecological and economic and cultural benefits of oysters is to introduce a non-native species. But before we take that drastic and entirely irreversible step, I think it's important to look at the longer term picture offered by archaeology and to better understand the resilience of both the ecosystems and the cultures that have relied on oysters in the past. And so that was kind of the impetus for this particular project. The archaeological portion involved research on the Road River, so just south of Annapolis, Fishing Bay on the eastern shore, and a part kind of upstream, but still very much in the estuary on the Rappahannock River. About six archaeological sites were excavated at each location, and these, for the most part, span about the last 3,000 years, although we'll talk about an earlier site later on. So the archaeological record provides us information about oysters, but through the lens of human use, right? So these are oysters that were selected out of the ecosystem, selected out of the environment, and deposited in archaeological sites. We needed a bigger picture than that, though. So we also worked with Dr. Rowan Lockwood at William & Mary, who's a paleontologist, and so she provided information about fossil oyster reefs. So these are places where oysters grew naturally long before humans arrived in Chesapeake Bay, so tens and hundreds of thousands of years ago. So these are natural formations of oysters. And then we also worked with a number of oyster biologists working in the bay today who are taking measurements off of modern oyster reefs. So again, natural formations of oyster, but the ones that are living in the bay today. Now, one of the problems when we're working with all of these different scientists is finding measurements that we can all use to explore our data sets. And we actually settled on something really very simple, which is shell height. So this is what, of course, is used to regulate the modern fishery today, right? That oysters have to be a certain size before they can be harvested. And biologists use this as kind of a proxy for the health of the modern oyster populations. If oysters are generally larger, it's considered to be a healthier population. So this is what we expected to see. We kind of expected to see oysters basically staying the same size until people started harvesting them in earnest, followed by a steady decline through time to the modern day. And we expected this because it's pretty similar to what we see all over the world. Even relatively small human populations tend to have an impact bigger than you would expect on shellfish. But here's what we actually saw. So you can see here that although there are considerable fluctuations in average size of oysters throughout different time periods, there's not really any particular trend towards smaller oysters. And in fact, among the changes that are visible, right, that you could sort of pick out with your eye, most of these aren't statistically significant. So sort of when we look at them through various statistical tests, they're meaningless. They aren't real differences. There are two exceptions, two places where we do see statistically different sizes of oysters. The first of these is during the colonial period, when, contrary to what we were expecting, we actually saw bigger oysters rather than smaller oysters. There are a couple of possible reasons for this that we hadn't really thought of. So the first is that Europeans introduced oyster tongs. So this allowed the harvest of deeper of oysters further offshore, and these oysters do tend to grow a little bit larger. So that would almost certainly bring larger oysters into these historic period sites. The other thing that's kind of interesting that we think we're seeing here is the very early stages of nitrogen runoff into Chesapeake Bay. So today, nitrogen is a major pollutant in the bay. It's a serious issue because it causes a process called eutrophication that removes oxygen from the system. So when there's too much nitrogen, that's a very bad thing. But there might have been a sort of a brief period early on during the sort of early to mid 19th century when nitrogen was just starting to enter the bay from fertilizers, and it was fertilizing the bay, helping oysters grow larger. This is a little bit out there as a hypothesis, but some chemical work on oyster shell by some of my colleagues is actually confirming this, or at least supports the hypothesis. So it's kind of interesting. We think probably both of these things are happening. So the second and not at all surprising statistical difference is in modern oysters, which are significantly smaller than any other group of oysters in our sample. Okay, this is another way of looking at the same data. I want to explain this a little bit and then pick out a few patterns. So what you're looking at here is that oysters were sort of put into groups. So for example, from prehistoric archaeological sites, just over 5% of oysters were between 35 and 45 millimeters long, or just over 15% were between 45 and 55 millimeters long, and so forth. And then at the top, we have the fossil reef sample from long before people arrived in the Middle Atlantic. Here we have these archaeological sites, so selected by people before and after European contact. And at the bottom, we have the modern samples from Upper Chesapeake, Lower Chesapeake, and some from out on the Atlantic coast. Okay, I want to draw your attention to a few different patterns that we're seeing here. So first is the difference between natural oyster reefs and archaeological sites where oysters were selected by people. People were clearly avoiding the smallest size oysters, which are abundant here in natural reefs. So this suggests that, well, it's not surprising that people don't want the smallest oysters. If they're collecting them, they may well be putting them back into the ecosystem. In natural reefs, there are more juvenile oysters than adult oysters, which is exactly what we would expect out of a population in the real world. Which of course means we have to wonder what's going on here, right? How can we have a population of oysters or a population of anything in which there aren't juveniles? The answer to that is that oysters in the upper part of Chesapeake Bay aren't reproducing very well. Instead, baby oysters, which are called spat, are brought in from elsewhere and deposited to grow to full size. So we do not have that sort of smallest size class because those oysters actually just don't exist in the upper part of Chesapeake Bay. Okay, and then the other thing that we can see very clearly here is the damage being done to modern oysters by disease. So if we look back at these natural oyster reefs from before the arrival of humans, about half of those oysters are larger than 115 millimeters. Those are basically absent from the modern oyster population. And the reason for this is that very few oysters today survive beyond 4 or 5 years because of disease. So it's a really striking illustration of the change between sort of what an oyster reef used to look like and what an oyster reef looks like today. Okay, so what we've learned specifically about oysters, first is that indigenous people here had very, very little impact on oysters for thousands of years, right? They harvested these oysters in the billions. The sites that I've shown you tonight are a tiny proportion of the thousands upon thousands of identical sites that are found all over the shores of Chesapeake. So they were harvesting huge numbers of oysters, and they were harvesting those for a couple to 3,000 years and didn't have any noticeable impact, certainly not at the scale of the whole bay. And the reason, or some reasons that this was probably the case, one is that they were largely harvesting from the nearshore environment. They weren't using oyster tongs or dredges that allowed them to get into deeper waters. This meant that there was always sort of a reserve population that could repopulate the nearshore area. We also know that indigenous people typically didn't harvest from a single area for years and years on end. So one of the suggestions we've made is that marine protected areas are fantastic. They allow that sort of reserve population of oysters that can repopulate other areas, but maybe to sort of mimic the way that indigenous people use this environment, those areas could move year to year. The other thing that's very different is when indigenous people ate oysters in Chesapeake Bay, or when they harvested oysters in Chesapeake Bay, they consumed them in Chesapeake Bay, often within spitting distance of Chesapeake Bay. And this is something that certainly was not continued into the modern period when oysters were shipped all over the country. So perhaps consuming Chesapeake oysters in Chesapeake Bay is the only way to maintain a sustainable and resilient ecosystem here. Okay, oysters are great, but oysters are just one part of the Chesapeake picture. And some more recent work has given us a little glimpse at a different version of Chesapeake ecosystems. This is very preliminary, but it's also very intriguing, which is why I wanted to share it with you tonight. So I said earlier that oysters are a very easy target in Chesapeake archaeological record because shell middens here are basically all oyster. So usually what we're looking at is a whole bunch of oyster with tiny amounts of tagless and soft shell clam that get incorporated as well. But people came to the shores of Chesapeake Bay to eat oysters, and oysters are what they ate. Now, we had already kind of noticed that the earliest site within any given watershed is a little bit different. Still mostly oyster, but a little bit more clam. So the earliest site in the Road River or the earliest site in Fishing Bay just had a little bit more clam in it. Our working hypothesis has sort of been that this was because ecosystems hadn't fully settled in, so to speak. that they were still forming, the oyster reefs were still developing, and that people were sort of arriving just at that edge when the ecosystem wasn't fully developed. But sites were so rare that we haven't really been able to fully explore this idea. I've also already mentioned that there are very few sites from the bay's early formation, right? So this is a period that archaeologically we refer to as the Archaic period. And we have very, very few sites. And of these few sites, the ones up here in the north part of the bay haven't really been fully excavated and reported. So this one site on the Potomac River is really the only good snapshot that we have of this period. Until I was fortunate to find a site, purely by accident really, dating to this time period on the Rappahannock River. So in the study area on the Rappahannock, most of the sites look exactly the way I expected them to look. Mostly oyster with just a little bit of clam. But there was one site that looked very, very different. And actually, when I excavated the site, I was expecting it to be maybe modern, right? Just some people eating a somewhat unexpected collection of shellfish within the last few decades. I was very surprised when I found out how old it was. So this archaic site looks completely different. There is still oyster, but all sorts of other species are mixed in. Some of the same clams that we see later in time, the Tagalus and the soft shell clam, but also a bit of bay scallop and a bit of this angel wing clam. So just to show you how unusual this is, I've been able to find, I think, one other reference to an angel wing clam found in a Chesapeake archaeological site. This is quite rare. And then in addition to these species, this little guy decided to join the party, the Atlantic mud crab. I had to get help from a biologist in identifying the crab claws because I had no idea. I'd only ever seen blue crab in sites here, so I didn't even know what I was looking at. So why is this late archaic shellfish assemblage on the Rappahannock so weird? Angel wing clam, bay scallop, mud crab completely disappear from Chesapeake middens. Tagalus and soft shell clam continue, but they make up tiny, tiny parts of the archaeological sites, all in favor of Eastern oyster that takes over. Now, in an ecological system, today, the Eastern oyster occurs in significantly larger numbers and higher densities, right? They form these massive reefs that are easily visible even at high tide. So these clam species, on the other hand, they burrow into the sediments. People would have to search for them individually instead of being able to collect a lot at once. The bay scallop is very good at hiding among seagrasses. The mud crab is a tiny animal, only about 5 centimeters apart or across at the carapace. I'm still not really sure why the mud crab claws were in this site. All of these species, though, are still present in the bay today and presumably were present for the last 4,500 years. But people don't seem to have been using them, relying instead on these abundant oysters. It's just one site, and it's difficult to draw too many conclusions from a single site because there are a few different possible explanations. But it seems possible that people were harvesting these more difficult shellfish because oysters were not yet abundant, or at least not as abundant as they were going to become later in time, making it important or necessary to supplement with other shellfish. There's some support for this. Juvenile oysters search for a hard substrate before they settle, and they often attach to other oyster shells. This is how they develop into these large reefs. So as these brackish waters expanded with sea level rise, those reefs would have required some time to build up. right? They just take time to develop. So I suspect that this site on the Rappahannock happens to capture a very short period in the ecological succession of Chesapeake Bay as brackish waters sort of reached a certain point, but oysters hadn't had time to build into reefs. People at that point may have searched for the many other types of shellfish available in the intertidal zone, which could have colonized these new estuaries a little more quickly without having to wait for reef formation. So what does that mean? Why is this potentially valuable information? Today, there are millions of dollars spent on the restoration of Chesapeake Bay's native oyster and blue crab populations, and this is a worthy goal. It goes hand in hand with broader ecological restoration and important economic revitalization. But when you read the justification for these projects, they often start with something like, in the 17th and 18th century, oysters were abundant in Chesapeake Bay. That's true, of course, and the research I've presented here suggests that it was true for much longer than just a couple of centuries. But there might also be a more nuanced story. Scallops have seen a recent increase in restoration interest, but it's typically kind of viewed as a happy result of the restoration of eelgrass beds, not really the target for restoration. And interesting more from sort of a culinary perspective than an ecological perspective. Most people are unaware of many of these clam species even existing in Chesapeake Bay. They don't have a lot of cultural or culinary appeal here. Never heard of anyone trying to restore angel wing clam. They look like this in real life. Not exactly a great poster child for conservation and restoration. But just like was happening 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, sea level rise is very rapid again on Chesapeake Bay, well above global average, and it's only going up. The site on the Rappahannock River seems to have captured a moment of relatively rapid sea level rise in the past and suggests that maybe oysters are not the only answer to Chesapeake Bay ecosystems. Clams and scallops once contributed to sort of this massive filtering machine that cleaned Chesapeake waters. And the communities that included all of these species may have been very well adapted to conditions of sea level rise. They may also have been adapted to muddy and sandy substrates that didn't have oyster, sort of oyster reefs yet. So it may be time, perhaps, to turn our attention to the restoration of some of these more undervalued shellfish. So, again, one strategy that we could consider would be to mimic indigenous harvest practices in the oyster fishery. So, reduced overall harvest pressure, focusing on some areas while leaving other areas as sort of seed populations for reproduction, and perhaps consumption only in the local area. But we also might want to start thinking about more effort on restoring some of the other shellfish species that might be better adapted to 21st century conditions. And I want to just conclude by thanking the many other people beside myself who were involved in this research, including a small army of interns at the Smithsonian who I think in the end measured something like 20,000 oyster shells from archaeological sites. So they did a phenomenal job and are sort of the backbone of this research.
Well, thank you, Dr. Reeder-Myers. That was a really interesting lecture, and I don't think people think about the Chesapeake Bay and scallops and clams, but you know, it might be something that we're moving forward to with that. We're going to start our question and answer section, and I would encourage our participants to go down to the Q&A section of your Zoom screen, and if you have any questions, please type those in for that. And we'll get to them as we go along with the question and answer. So I encourage you to do that. So we have a number of questions, and some of them are asking about what disease is where you were talking about in the 1980s. Some folks are not familiar with the diseases that hit the oysters in that time period.
So there are two different diseases that are the big players today. One is called MSX and one is called dermo. I'm afraid you would have to ask an oyster biologist for more details. I think those are both bacterial, but I don't even know that much. I do at least know the names. That's as far as I can get you, I'm afraid.
Okay, but they did have a major impact on the all of the oysters of the Chesapeake Bay.
Yes, and I should also point out, and again, an oyster biologist would be able to give you a lot more detail here, but one of those did already exist, and I believe it was dermo that was introduced in the 80s, and that's, it had sort of was putting up with the other one, and the new one did a huge amount of damage.
Thank you. Someone wants to know where the description of a midden came from, how that was developed.
Well, the idea of a midden as a trash heap has actually been really important. Archaeologists for centuries have really liked digging through other people's trash. That's sort of where we get a lot of our best information. So the concept of a midden has been really important for a long time. And then these shell middens that are specific, I mean, they're not specific to Chesapeake Bay, but specific to having mostly shell in them, are also a concept that have been around for a pretty good long time. They're very popular targets for archaeologists because of the really good preservation that we find there.
So personal question, as you're going through the midden, did you happen to be able to record how the native peoples ate the oysters? Were there burn marks where they put them in the fire? Where they obviously broke it open with obviously not an oyster knife, but
Right.
with a knife or a tool?
Yeah. That's a very good question, and it's one we actually tried to answer. If you happen to be on the National Mall sometime around 2012, you might have seen some crazy people jumping up and down trying to crush oyster out there. We looked into it. We did some experiments looking at different methods of shucking, looking at steaming and roasting in different ways. And at the end of the day, we actually couldn't tell the difference, unfortunately. So we really don't know how people were eating them. We know from records of early Europeans in this area who were writing things down that they saw people steaming and roasting oysters. So we know that was an option, but they certainly might have also been using rocks or implements to open the shells. We don't know, unfortunately.
Very good. So you mentioned earlier in your presentation about oysters moving in on some of the other shellfish in the bay. So one person asked, does it mean that technically oysters are invasive?
Well, I suppose any species could be considered invasive if you go far enough back in time. But usually we reserve that for species that have been brought in artificially, and for species that are disrupting an ecosystem. So for instance, if you look at the plants in your garden, some of them might be considered invasive because they can escape and wreak havoc on the surrounding ecosystem. Others aren't native, but they aren't considered invasive. So in the case of oysters, yes, I suppose if we sort of look at a really long time scale, but they aren't hurting the ecosystem, right? They are foundational to making the rest of this ecosystem work. So from sort of a technical ecological definition, we wouldn't consider them invasive, but that's a really interesting way of looking at it.
So another question asked about, what is the regulated level of oyster harvesting today, and how does that compare to regulated levels in the 20th century?
Again, that's actually a good question that I am probably not the right person to answer, but my understanding is that we have started to see a rebound since about maybe 2016, 2017, that oysters are starting to do a little bit better. And then, of course, there's also the idea of oyster farming in the Chesapeake that's, I think, also starting to take off. So, it's not only a question now of harvesting wild oysters. There are other ways to get oysters in there. And an oyster is going to filter just as much water if it's farmed or wild. So both of those are sort of important methods. As for exact catch record or catch limits, though, I'm afraid I really don't know.
And you answered another question, but with that one. All right. A couple of people ask about when you mentioned about how eating oysters locally can help the oyster population in the bay. Can you speak to that just a little bit more?
Sure. And of course, it's not, it's just a way of controlling harvest, right? That certainly hasn't been an issue lately. And in fact, there are still oyster packing plants around Chesapeake Bay that are packing oysters from the Gulf of Mexico or from other parts of the world that are being shipped in. But as we're rebuilding the oyster fishery here, maybe we should sort of think about keeping those oysters for local cultures, for local populations, instead of trying to ship them out the way that it was happening in much of the 19th and 20th century. And for a certain, the oyster fishery to the north of us in New York and then in Delaware Bay, so those collapsed earlier than the one in Chesapeake Bay. And so we were shipping oysters, well, I guess I'm sitting here on Delaware Bay. You were shipping oysters north to New York. And so that's the kind of thing that I think there's value in avoiding that in the future. Right? If this is a valuable part of the Chesapeake culture, that in itself is worth continuing rather than sending oysters out to other places. It's not an issue today because there aren't enough oysters, but as we're sort of planning for what happens as hopefully the fishery improves.
One person asked about the salinity in the upper part of the Chesapeake Bay. Does that impact the oyster growing season, the slower pace? Would that cause for the decline in the oyster population?
Very much so. So because of changes in runoff and changes in sort of the whole world surrounding Chesapeake Bay, there's a lot more fresh water coming into the upper part of the Chesapeake. And so that's a very large part of the reason why oysters up there don't reproduce very well. And that's unfortunate because it's very, very hard to fix. It's a very hard system to sort of flip that switch and improve, raise the salinity. That said, my colleagues at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center there on the Road River, just south of Annapolis, are starting to see oysters reproduce better. They're starting to see more reproduction going on their research reefs, which is really exciting to hear. And I don't know if that trend's going to continue or, in fact, I don't know what's happened to that trend in the last 2 years. Thanks to COVID, I haven't really heard a lot about it, but it was certainly exciting to hear at one point. Hopefully there is an improvement going on.
So a question kind of related to seawater rise and water volume. Has the volume of the water in the Chesapeake Bay changed or increased fairly the same? Is that going to impact the oysters and their job in the Chesapeake Bay?
So sea level rise is a really complex issue, or it's a very complex phenomenon, I should say. And sea levels in the Mid-Atlantic rise relatively rapidly, even without sort of 21st century climate change. They would be rising anyway. They're just rising faster because of what we're doing to the climate. So yes, the volume of water is going to keep going up in Chesapeake Bay. The question is it going to go up faster than the ecosystem can adapt? And that is a huge question that I could give, we could give a whole other lecture on. But there are a lot of ways we can help that adaptation. The restoration of the eelgrass and other kind of wetland areas is really important. because that traps sediment and keeps it from flowing out into the bay. So those sorts of things help combat the problems that happen with sea level rise and help these shorelines adapt as sea levels are rising. So sea levels are going to keep rising. They would keep rising no matter what we did, but they're going to keep rising. Chesapeake Bay is accustomed to that, right? That's normal for them to rise at a certain pace. The question is whether we've changed the shoreline so much that it really can't adapt anymore. A lot of the effort that we go to stop things from eroding, of course, often actually make it worse, even if they're making it worse somewhere else that we don't care about as much. So if we could just snap our fingers and send Chesapeake Bay back to its natural state, I think it could easily adapt to sea level rise, and oyster ecosystems would just keep on going without really a problem. But we can't do that. And so the question of sort of how we help that adaptation today, how we deal with hardened shorelines that are causing erosion, how we restore wetlands, all of those things are really important to that question.
And a question about how does the collapse of the oyster population in the Chesapeake Bay compare to other East Coast areas? They asked about North Carolina. You also mentioned New York and New Jersey, Delaware Bay. How does that compare? Yeah,
so there's actually there's a book that I can't think of the name of off the top of my head that goes through this process where we see these sequential collapses going down the coast. And there are a few reasons why it happens that way. It's a little easier for oysters to live further south. They just kind of have an advantage already. And then, of course, populations tend to be larger further to the north. So we do see this sequential collapse going down the coast through the sort of late 19th and early 20th century. That said, if you go further south down into the Carolinas and into Florida and certainly along the Gulf Coast, they're much healthier oyster populations today. Lower human populations, but still, a lot of oyster fishing that's going on. They're healthier than they are here, but they're still not healthy, right? They're still severely damaged. And what we see, one way we see that is when major storms come through, that those populations don't rebound the way that we might expect them to if they were really truly healthy ecosystems. I think did that answer the question? Sometimes I sort of wander off and forget what I'm supposed to be answering.
I think that's okay. And maybe one last question, kind of hypothetical. It says, if you were given unlimited funds to improve oyster populations, how would you spend it?
That's a very good question. There is probably a better answer to this, but with off the cuff, I would say that providing infrastructure for oyster farming would be pretty huge. So that's something that it's very difficult, right? It requires a certain amount of capital to just get started. In addition to regulations and all that, that's really kind of out of my wheelhouse, frankly. But making sure that waterman communities can sort of engage in this new sector of the economy, making sure that this new sector of the economy exists in general, I think would be really valuable. So I feel like oyster farming is really important to moving forward. After that, I would say those wetland restorations are also really, really important. That's what stabilizes the rest of the system and kind of creates a baseline for everything else. After that, well, I mean, I guess if I could just sort of get rid of all of the agricultural pollution, but I suspect that there would be some very angry farmers with good reason. It's not a black and white issue, right? Where we can just wipe an entire sector of the economy off the map so that the sector of the economy can do better. So yeah, I think if I could just sort of do massive projects directly in Chesapeake Bay, oyster farming and wetland restoration would be the two big ones.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you for a wonderful lecture, Dr. Reader Byers. We appreciate that. And we want to thank all of our participants tonight. Thank you for joining us for this lecture. And we also like to thank our sponsors, JP Morgan and the Homestead Gardens. We're hoping you're able to join us for our 5th lecture in the series by Mr. Vince Leggett. It is entitled Blacks of the Chesapeake's Campaign to Preserve a Local Legacy, Elktonia, Cars, and Sparrows Beach. And there's a link to the program in the chat box. So if you'd like to join us for that, please do. Again, thank you for joining us tonight. And if you have any more questions for Dr. Reader Byers, there is an email address again in the chat box, and you can send her an email and to ask additional questions you may think of later on. So again, thank you for joining us this evening, and have a great evening.